In the pharmacy aisle at 3 in the morning, under the humming lights that made everything look sharper than it needed to, my son turned to me and said, "You're overreacting." His voice wasn't raised. He didn't hiss it or slam the words at me. It was calm, dismissive, as though he were swatting a fly. But the way it landed, flat and certain, made the whole aisle feel colder. I stood there with the small box in my hand, the kind that requires you to squint at the label twice before you know if you're picking the right version. My eyes lingered longer than necessary, reading the same warnings twice, though I wasn't really processing the words. All I could hear was the echo of his sentence. Overreacting. I paid cash because something in me didn't want the trail on the bank statement, as if embarrassment could stain digits the same way it had stained me. The cashier didn't look at me, and I was grateful. I slid the receipt into my coat pocket with fingers that trembled more than they should have, and followed him out into the night air. The parking lot was nearly empty, just 2 cars angled under flickering street lamps. I walked slower than usual, listening to the crunch of gravel under my shoes. He walked ahead, shoulders stiff, phone already out, as though the conversation we just had could be erased by a glowing screen. He didn't look back, not once, and I found myself watching the small bob of his head in the dark, the tilt of his shoulders, and wondering when that had become the shape of dismissal instead of the shape of comfort. The car door was heavy in my hand. I slid into the passenger seat, clutching the bag as though it were something fragile. We didn't speak on the drive home. He hummed along to something on the radio, distracted, while I stared at the streetlights bending over us like silent witnesses. Every mile stretched longer than it should have, and in each one I heard his words again. Overreacting. A word that made me feel both too much and not enough at the same time. When we got home, I didn't turn on the kitchen light. I sat at the table in the dim glow from the stove clock, the little bag still in my hand. My son had gone straight upstairs. I heard his door close, quick and certain, like punctuation. I sat there a long time, listening to the silence, wondering how many nights had ended like this without me noticing. It wasn't just about the pharmacy. That's what kept circling in my head. The way he'd said it, the ease of it, told me this wasn't new. This was just the first time I heard it for what it really was. I thought about when he was a boy, how he used to reach for my hand without hesitation. In grocery stores, in parking lots, even crossing the narrow street in our neighborhood. His fingers would grip mine like the world might fall away if he let go. That memory arrived uninvited, sharp and painful, and I sat there at the table feeling as though I had crossed some invisible border where his hand would never reach for mine again. The clock ticked louder than it usually did. I set the bag down, smoothed the crinkled plastic, and opened the box just to prove to myself that it was real. I read the instructions again, every line. My eyes blurred halfway through, but I forced myself to finish, even though I didn't need to. Reading was the only control I had in that moment. If I understood the directions, if I folded the leaflet neatly and tucked it back inside, maybe I could hold together the pieces of myself that were coming loose. When I finally went upstairs, the hall light was still on. I paused outside his door, listening. There was music, faint laughter through his phone. He sounded lighter, free of the weight I still carried in my chest. I didn't knock. I went to my room, shut the door quietly, and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark. I thought about how quickly a single word can undo you. Not a curse, not an insult, just a dismissal small enough to slip under the skin. Overreacting. It made me think of every time I'd tried to speak up in the past and been told I was making too much of it. The memories lined up, one by one, each with the same undertone: me too loud, me too emotional, me too much. I lay down without changing, without brushing my teeth, staring at the ceiling as though answers were hidden in the plaster. My mind kept replaying the scene in the aisle, the brightness of the lights, the coldness of his voice, the way my hands shook as I held the box. I couldn't stop turning it over in my head, and by dawn, I still hadn't slept. Morning came like a thief. Sunlight edged through the blinds, harsh and unforgiving. I dragged myself to the kitchen, made coffee, and set the mug in front of me. He came down later, hair messy, yawning, scrolling his phone. He didn't look at me as he poured cereal into a bowl. I wanted to say something. I wanted to ask if he remembered, if he realized how his words had landed. But the silence between us had thickened overnight, and I found myself trapped in it. I sipped my coffee, tasting nothing, and he carried on like the night before hadn't happened. That was the beginning, though I didn't know it then. A pharmacy aisle at 3 a.m, a word tossed carelessly into the air, and me catching it like a stone I couldn't put down. Over the days that followed, I caught myself moving differently. I paused before speaking, weighing my tone, my words. I read labels more carefully, not because I needed to but because it gave me something to hold on to. I started writing notes to myself, reminders, grocery lists, half-finished thoughts, just so I had proof of my own memory, my own judgment. It was as though I needed to validate every step I took, every decision I made, to guard against the accusation that I was overreacting. And yet, beneath all of that, there was a quieter truth forming. Not sharp, not immediate, but steady. His dismissal had cracked something open, and once opened, it couldn't be shut. I started seeing the patterns I had ignored before, the way my concerns were brushed aside, the way my voice slid to the edges of conversations. The word he'd chosen had history behind it, and now, at last, I was hearing the echo of every time it had been spoken in different forms, by different mouths. I realized then that this wasn't just about my son. It was about me. About how much I had allowed myself to shrink so others could feel comfortable. About how many times I had silenced myself to keep the peace. That night in the pharmacy wasn't the first wound, it was simply the one that finally made me feel the sting. The morning after that pharmacy night, I tried to carry on as if nothing had shifted. I poured tea, let the steam curl toward my face, and waited for it to cool enough to sip. Routine has a way of making you believe things are steady, and I leaned on it like a crutch. My son came down late, scrolling his phone as though the screen contained a safer version of the world. He asked if I needed anything before he left for the day, and though I had a list sitting right on the table, I shook my head. He didn't notice. Or maybe he chose not to. Either way, the door closed behind him, and I stood in the kitchen longer than I needed to, listening to the house breathe around me. When I opened the cabinet to put away the mug, I saw the small box tucked behind the tea canisters. I had placed it there the night before, deliberately choosing a spot where it wouldn't be found by accident. I took it down, unfolded the leaflet inside, and read every line again. It wasn't that I had forgotten what it said. It was that I needed the reassurance that words on paper don't move the way words in a person's mouth can. Instructions are steady. They don't dismiss you. They don't call you an overreaction. They simply sit there, clear and faithful, until you decide to follow them. Later that day, I called the clinic. My voice was steady, though I held the receiver too tightly, my knuckles whitening around it. I gave my details, spelled out my name, and asked for the earliest morning slot they could give me. Mornings are best for honesty, I thought. They come before you've had the chance to talk yourself out of what you need. I wrote the date on the calendar with a heavy pen stroke, pressing down hard enough that the letters indented through the page. That evening, when my son came home, he was careful. His voice was even, his questions light. He asked about my day but didn't wait long for my answers. He rinsed his plate without looking up, then disappeared into his room with the door left half open, a signal that was neither invitation nor closure. I stayed at the sink longer than necessary, washing one cup, then drying it, then setting it down again. What I wanted wasn't a fight. What I wanted was to feel seen. But that night ended like the one before it, me in silence, him in a different room, the distance between us a thing we both pretended not to measure. At 2 a.m, I woke as though tugged by an invisible thread. I walked to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, then left it untouched on the counter. I opened the cabinet, checked that the box was still there, then shut the door gently. The act felt almost ceremonial, as though by confirming its presence, I could convince myself of my own. I leaned against the counter, staring into the dimness, and imagined the conversation we hadn't had. I told him in my mind how much that word had cut, how small I had felt in that aisle. In my imagination, he apologized. In reality, the house stayed silent. The appointment came quickly. The nurse's kindness unsettled me in its simplicity. She asked questions in a tone that didn't assume, didn't judge. I answered them all carefully, sometimes repeating myself, afraid I might miss something. I wanted her to see that I was paying attention, that I was not careless. She explained the plan, handed me a sheet of instructions, and smiled in a way that made me feel human again. When I left the clinic, the air outside felt clearer, though nothing had changed except the weight I carried inside me. For the first time in days, I thought, maybe I can manage this. On the walk home, I stopped at a thrift shop I hadn't been in for years. The smell of old fabric and wood polish met me at the door. I wasn't looking for anything, but my fingers brushed along the racks until they caught on a silk scarf the color of milky tea. I bought it without hesitation and tied it at my throat in the mirror by the exit. For the first time since that night, I felt something close to boldness. Not loud, not showy, just the quiet decision to own something for myself. The scarf cost almost nothing, but walking home with it, I felt richer. That evening, my son noticed it. He said it suited me. I thanked him, and the word thank you felt strange, as though I were speaking to a guest. He was gentle that night, unusually so. We had dinner without conflict, and he asked to use the car the next morning. I said yes. He promised to fill the tank. Our exchange was polite, almost formal, as though we were both treading carefully around the bruise of that night, neither of us daring to press on it. Before he went upstairs, he asked if I was okay. I told him I was. He nodded, satisfied, and left me there with the scarf still knotted at my throat. The following weekend, my sister called. Her voice carried the sound of her garden, birdsong faint in the background. She told me about her hydrangeas, stubbornly refusing to turn blue, no matter what soil treatment she tried. She asked about my son. I said he was busy. I said he was doing well. She hesitated, as though she wanted to ask more, but instead she told me about the neighbor's cat that had taken to sunning itself on her porch. After we hung up, I made tea and sat by the window. Across the street, a child climbed onto a wall, jumped down, climbed up again, and repeated the act until laughter carried him away. Watching him, I thought, sometimes you climb just to prove you can. My second appointment came. The doctor adjusted the plan, answered my questions without impatience. I asked one of them twice because I didn't like the way I had sounded the first time, too tentative, too apologetic. He answered both times as though each were new. I walked out with a new set of instructions, folded the paper neatly, and sat on a bench outside to read them twice. A woman passed by, holding a child by the hand, and smiled at me. I smiled back, surprised at how easy it felt. That afternoon, my son came home earlier than usual. He leaned in the kitchen doorway and said he'd been thinking. His words were hesitant, careful. He told me he hadn't meant to be unkind that night in the pharmacy. He said he'd been tired, that it had felt dramatic to be out at such an hour, but that it hadn't been fair to put that on me. He said worry makes people sharp sometimes. I listened, waiting. What I wanted was simple, I'm sorry. He didn't quite say it, but he came close. He pressed his lips together, put his hand flat on the table, leaving it open but not reaching. I placed my hand next to his, not on top. The distance was deliberate. We stayed like that for a moment, two hands on the same table, both of us practicing how to exist together without the silence turning hostile. After that, the house lightened in small ways. He asked before borrowing the car. I went for walks in the evening and bought myself fresh flowers once, just to watch them open. I baked lemon biscuits and left some with the neighbor who had asked me for ginger one night. She slid a note under my door the next day, it helped. Thank you. I tacked it into the same notebook where I'd kept the pharmacy receipt. It felt like balance, proof that not all exchanges left you empty. And yet, even with these small eases, I carried the word with me. Overreacting. Sometimes I heard it in the clink of a glass, or in the silence after a door closed. But I had also begun to notice something else. The scarf at my throat. The notebook with its careful entries. The appointments I kept without apology. These were not grand victories, but they were mine. And for the first time in a long while, I believed they were enough. In the weeks that followed, the house moved with a rhythm I hadn't known in some time. Not perfect, not seamless, but different. He asked more often, I answered more carefully. We treaded lightly around each other like two people crossing a thin bridge, each listening for the creak of the wood. The word that had cut me still lingered in the corners, but I began to notice it didn't sting quite as sharply. It was there, yes, but I had other things now, my scarf, my notebook, my tea rituals, the quiet proof that I could still choose for myself. One Sunday morning, I woke before him and went for a walk. The streets were quiet, the kind of quiet that belongs only to early hours when even the city seems unsure of itself. I walked past closed shops, past a bakery where the smell of warm bread leaked through the shutters, and down toward the park I hadn't visited in months. The grass was damp, shining faintly, and the benches were empty. I sat on one, pulled my scarf tighter, and listened. Birds, water moving lazily, the distant hum of traffic that hadn't fully woken yet. I realized I had missed this, the act of being somewhere without explanation, of simply sitting because I wanted to. When I came home, he was still asleep. I boiled water, made tea, and drank it slowly. By the time he came down, rubbing sleep from his eyes, I felt almost protective of my morning. It had been mine, untouched, and I wanted to keep it that way. He asked if I'd been out. I said yes. He nodded, surprised but not questioning, and went to pour cereal. That small exchange, simple as it was, felt like a turning point. I had done something for myself, not in secret but without needing permission, and he had accepted it without protest. Not long after, I decided to go back to the thrift shop. I told myself I needed nothing, and that was exactly why I went. The racks were full of the usual mix, shirts with missing buttons, dresses whose zippers stuck halfway, shoes with someone else's wear etched into them. I ran my hand over the fabrics, not looking for perfection, just looking for something that spoke. I found a cardigan, pale blue, soft at the edges from too many washes. I bought it and wore it home. It wasn't beautiful, not in the way new things are, but it felt lived in, steady. When I hung it in my closet, it felt less like an addition and more like reclaiming space. That night, as I folded laundry, my son came in and asked if I wanted to watch a movie. He hadn't asked me in months. I hesitated, part of me wary that it was obligation, not desire, but then I agreed. We sat together on the sofa, the screen flickering across our faces. The film was nothing remarkable, but the act of sharing it mattered. We laughed at the same scene once, at different volumes, and for a brief moment it felt like we were who we used to be. Not the same, but close enough to touch. Yet beneath these small comforts, I still felt a tremor, a low hum of something unresolved. His apology, or almost apology, had patched the surface, but the deeper ache was mine to address. That word had cracked something, and while I had covered it with scarves and tea and new habits, the crack remained. It showed itself in my hesitations, in the way I paused before speaking, in the extra care I took to measure how much space I occupied. Healing, I was beginning to understand, isn't about erasing the wound. It's about learning to move with it. One evening, while he was out, I took down the notebook again. I smoothed the receipt from the pharmacy, the note from the neighbor, and stared at them side by side. Proof of harm, proof of kindness. It struck me then how close they lived together, how one doesn't cancel the other but simply sits beside it. I wrote a line under them, not for anyone else but myself, you were there. It mattered. My handwriting looked steadier than I felt, but it was enough. The following week, he offered to come with me to the clinic. I was surprised he remembered. We drove in near silence, the radio filling the space between us. At the waiting room, he sat beside me, restless, scrolling through his phone, but his presence mattered more than what he did with it. When my name was called, he looked up, met my eyes briefly, and gave the smallest nod. It wasn't dramatic, but I carried it into the room with me like a small shield. The doctor asked questions, I answered, and for the first time, I didn't feel the need to over-explain. When I came out, he stood as if he'd been waiting, phone forgotten in his lap. On the drive home, he didn't ask much, and I didn't tell much, but the silence felt softer. Afterward, we stopped at a bakery, the same one I'd passed on my morning walks. I bought bread still warm from the oven, and we carried it home in a paper bag that fogged with steam. We ate it standing in the kitchen, tearing pieces with our hands. He said it was good, I agreed, and for that moment, we were simply two people sharing bread, nothing more complicated than that. And yet, I held on to it. Small moments can be anchors when the rest feels unsteady. Still, there were days the old patterns returned. He grew impatient when I asked questions twice. I grew defensive when he dismissed things lightly. The distance didn't vanish, it thinned, then thickened again depending on the day. I learned not to expect constancy, only to notice the shifts. On the difficult days, I went for walks, tied the scarf tighter, lit the small lamp in the hallway before the sun went down. Little things that told me I wasn't invisible, even to myself. One night, unable to sleep, I found myself back in the kitchen at 3 a.m., the same hour that had started it all. I didn't go to the cabinet this time. I didn't need to. I poured tea instead, sat by the window, and let the quiet settle around me. The city outside was muted, the occasional car passing like a ghost. I thought about that night in the aisle, about the word that had branded itself into me, and realized something had shifted. It still hurt, yes, but it no longer defined me. I had gathered enough proof of my own steadiness to carry it differently. The next morning, he came down as usual, hair messy, voice still thick with sleep. He saw the mug by the sink, the faint steam still rising, and asked if I'd been up long. I said not long. He nodded, poured coffee, and sat across from me. We didn't speak much, but the silence didn't weigh the way it once had. It felt like a pause, not an absence. Later that day, I drove to the park again. I walked the path around the lake, watched ducks glide over the water, watched children run along the grass, their shouts cutting the air clean. I sat on a bench, the same one as before, and let the sun warm my hands. I didn't think about the word, or the aisle, or the receipt. I thought only of the air, the water, the ordinary beauty of being present. And when I drove home, I realized something I hadn't before: the story hadn't ended that night. It had only begun. The word had hurt, but it had also forced me to see where I had been silent too long, where I had let myself shrink. And in the quiet aftermath, I had begun to claim space again, small at first, but space nonetheless. That evening, when he asked if I wanted to watch another film, I said yes. We sat together, the screen flickering again, and though the story on it wasn't remarkable, the one between us was. He leaned back, relaxed, and I allowed myself to do the same. For once, I wasn't holding my breath, waiting for the next word to cut. For once, I let myself believe in the possibility of repair. It was strange how quickly routine began to disguise itself as healing. Days folded neatly into one another, and if someone had asked me then, I might have said things were better. My son was kinder in small ways, asking before taking the car, washing the pans without complaint, sitting with me for a film once or twice a week. But beneath it, I felt the same thin thread stretched taut between us, humming with every step. I had learned to walk carefully, to keep my balance, but a thread isn't a bridge. It doesn't hold forever. One evening, as I was setting the table, he asked casually if I could lend him some money. He didn't look at me when he asked, just slid the words across the room like a note under a door. I froze, spoon in hand, the request settling heavier than it should have. It wasn't the money itself, I could manage it. It was the way he asked, as though my help were a given, as though the dismissal of that night had already been erased and replaced by this expectation. I said yes, of course, my voice softer than I wanted it to be. He thanked me, quick and careless, and moved on. But I carried the weight of it into the night. Later, alone in my room, I opened the notebook. I smoothed the receipt again, the note from the neighbor, my small line in my own handwriting: "You were there." It mattered. I added another line beneath it, being needed is not the same as being seen. The words looked harsh on the page, but true. I shut the notebook and sat in the dark, listening to the quiet, knowing I had reached another threshold I hadn't asked for. The next day, I tried to steady myself with small rituals. Tea in the morning. A walk to the market. The scarf tied at my throat. At the market, a woman asked if I wanted to split a bag of apples, too many for either of us alone. I agreed, and we walked back part of the way together, talking about nothing of importance. She told me about her grandchildren. I told her about the pears I'd bought weeks ago that had gone soft before I could finish them. We laughed lightly, strangers finding a brief ease. When we parted, I felt lighter than I had in days. It reminded me that connection didn't have to come only from family, that the world still held kindness in pockets I hadn't opened yet. That evening, my son came home late. He smelled faintly of beer and fatigue, dropped his bag by the door, and asked if there was anything to eat. I had already eaten, but I warmed leftovers for him. He sat at the table, scrolling through his phone while he ate. At one point he said, "You don't need to fuss so much," without looking up. The words were casual, but they sliced through me all the same. Fuss. Overreacting. Different words, same dismissal. I stood at the sink, washing a plate that didn't need washing, and felt the air thicken. I didn't answer. Silence felt safer. But inside, something shifted, heavy and sharp. That night, sleep wouldn't come. At 3, the hour that had marked me, I rose again. I didn't go to the cabinet. I didn't make tea. I stood in the hallway with the lamp casting its amber glow, and I listened to the house. His door was closed, music faint behind it, his life moving parallel to mine but never fully touching. I realized then that my silence had become a second dismissal, this one my own. By not speaking, I had been erasing myself just as effectively as he had. And the longer I did it, the more invisible I became. The next morning, over breakfast, I decided to test my voice. He was eating cereal, scrolling as usual. I said his name softly. He looked up, distracted. I told him that when he called me fussy, it felt like that night in the pharmacy all over again. He blinked, spoon paused in midair, surprised by the bluntness. He started to explain, to say he hadn't meant it like that, but I held up my hand. I told him I didn't need excuses. I needed him to understand that words, even small ones, carry weight. That I was tired of carrying them alone. My voice shook, but I didn't stop. When I finished, the silence between us was heavy, but not the same silence as before. This one was full of recognition. He set the spoon down. He didn't say much, only, "Okay. I hear you." It wasn't an apology, not in the way I wanted, but it was acknowledgement. I realized then that acknowledgement can sometimes be enough. That speaking, even shakily, mattered more than what came back. I had put my voice into the air, and it hadn't disappeared. After he left for the day, I walked to the park. I sat on the same bench by the lake, watching ducks carve lazy lines across the water. I thought about how often I had equated silence with peace, how often I had swallowed my words for the sake of keeping calm. And I wondered how much of my life had been lived that way, quiet, careful, shrinking. The realization stung, but it also steadied me. Because if silence was a choice, then so was speaking. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in years. I cooked a meal not because it was practical, but because I wanted to. Something slow, something fragrant, something that filled the house with the kind of warmth that asks to be noticed. When he came home, he looked surprised. He asked if it was a special occasion. I shook my head. "No," I said. "I just wanted to." The words tasted different, lighter, freer. We ate together, and though the conversation was ordinary, I felt a quiet victory in every bite. The meal had been for me first, for him second. That balance mattered. Over the next week, I noticed subtle changes. I said no once, when he asked for the car. I said not tonight, when he suggested a movie I didn't feel like watching. Each time, he blinked, surprised, but didn't push. And each time, I felt the air around me shift, as though the room itself acknowledged the difference. Saying no didn't end the world. It simply reminded me that I was in it. One evening, I went back to the thrift shop. I wasn't looking for anything, but I found a small ceramic vase, chipped at the rim but still beautiful. I bought it, brought it home, and set it on the table with a single flower. It wasn't much, but when I looked at it, I saw more than a vase. I saw proof that I could choose beauty for myself, even in small, imperfect forms. That night, as I washed the dishes, I caught my reflection in the dark window, scarf tied loosely, cardigan soft at the shoulders, hand steady. For the first time in a long time, I saw not just a mother, not just someone's shadow, but myself. The word overreacting still echoed sometimes, uninvited, like a draft under a door. But I had begun to answer it differently. With scarves. With flowers. With no when I meant no. With yes when I wanted yes. It wasn't about him anymore, not entirely. It was about me, learning that my own steadiness didn't have to depend on anyone else's approval. And as the days stretched forward, I understood something I hadn't on that first night, that hurt, even when it comes from those closest to us, can become a mirror. And in that mirror, if we're willing to look long enough, we might finally see ourselves again. The balance we had found was fragile, and I knew it. Every small no, every honest word, every pause before agreeing, it stitched something back inside me, but it also tugged at the fabric between us. One night, it finally tore. He had come home late, his voice sharp with exhaustion, his movements loud in the quiet kitchen. He opened the fridge, frowned at what was missing, and muttered something about how I never kept the right things in the house. The words weren't cruel, not outright, but they landed with the same weight as all the others before them. I felt the sting of old habits rising, the urge to apologize, to defend, to fill the silence with excuses. Instead, I stood still. I told him calmly that I bought what I could, that if he needed something specific, he could write it down or pick it up himself. He turned, eyebrows raised, the disbelief plain on his face. For a moment, he looked like the boy he had been when he first learned that his mother wasn't always going to bend. He laughed, short and humorless. "You're making too big a deal out of everything lately." The sentence hung between us like smoke. Once, I would have swallowed it. Once, I would have smoothed it over with silence. But I couldn't this time. The word too big echoed too close to overreacting, and I felt the weight of every night, every hesitation, every swallowed no. I told him I wasn't making too big a deal. I told him I was done being small for the sake of keeping peace. My voice trembled, but I didn't stop. I told him that when he dismissed me, it wasn't just about that moment, it was about every time I had trusted him to listen and been met with a shrug. I told him I loved him, but love couldn't keep excusing hurt. He froze, spoon in his hand, eyes caught between defiance and something softer. I could see him struggling, his mouth opening, closing, his chest rising like he was holding in words he didn't know how to shape. For a moment, neither of us moved. The kitchen clock ticked loudly. My hands were shaking, but they were steady enough to rest flat on the table, palms open, proof that I was here, present, unwilling to vanish again. "Finally," he said, "I didn't realize. I didn't think." His voice was quiet, uneven. He set the spoon down like it had become too heavy. "I guess I got used to you just being there." It wasn't an apology, not fully, but it was the closest he had come to laying his own truth bare. And in that small admission, I heard the echo of something I hadn't expected: fear. Fear of needing me. Fear of losing me. Fear of facing the ways he leaned on me without seeing me. I nodded, tears blurring my vision but not falling. I told him I wasn't disappearing, but I needed him to see me while I was here, not after. The words felt like they had lived in my chest for years, waiting for a door to open. Saying them aloud was both terrifying and freeing. He didn't argue. He sat down across from me, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. The silence this time was not sharp. It was heavy, but in a way that felt like both of us were finally carrying it together. That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked the hall, touched the scarf draped over the back of a chair, opened the notebook again. I added a new line beneath the others. I spoke. He listened. The handwriting shook, but it was legible. I closed the book and pressed my palm flat against the cover, feeling the ridges of the words beneath. Proof. The next morning was quiet. He came down earlier than usual, hair uncombed, eyes tired. He made his own coffee without asking if I wanted any, then hesitated, poured a second cup, and set it in front of me without a word. I looked at the steam rising, the smallest gesture, and knew it was an answer, not enough to heal everything, but enough to mark the beginning of something different. That afternoon, I took myself to the park again. The air was crisp, the lake reflecting the sky in fractured pieces. I sat on the bench and let the sunlight fall across my lap. For the first time since that night in the pharmacy aisle, I didn't replay his words in my head. Instead, I replayed mine. I had spoken. I had stood. And the world hadn't collapsed. The ducks still circled. Children still shouted. The air still smelled faintly of grass and earth. Life went on, and I was in it, no longer silent. Walking back, I felt the scarf brush against my neck, soft, steady. A reminder that sometimes strength is woven, thread by thread, out of small acts, reading a label twice, buying a scarf, writing a line in a notebook, saying no, saying yes, saying enough. When I reached home, I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and for once didn't hesitate in the hallway. I moved through the house with a steadiness that felt new. He was at the table, scribbling something on a pad, and he looked up when I came in. He didn't speak, but his eyes lingered on me longer than they usually did. I sat across from him, not waiting for words, not offering any. Just sitting, present. Seen. And for the first time, the silence between us felt like possibility. The weeks after that night did not transform everything at once. Life rarely works like that. My son still came home tired, sometimes careless, sometimes too quick with his words. I still caught myself pausing before I spoke, measuring the space I dared to take. But something had shifted, subtle, steady, like the turning of a tide you only notice when the shoreline is different. I began walking more often, even when I had no errand. Some days I stopped at the park, others I simply traced the quiet streets, listening to the shuffle of my own steps. I liked the way the world felt when it was mine alone, the breeze catching my scarf, the weight of coins in my pocket, the sight of neighbors tending to their small routines. Each walk reminded me I existed beyond anyone's approval. At home, I kept the vase filled, even if only with one flower. Sometimes it was a daisy from the corner shop, sometimes just a green stem I plucked from a hedge on my way back. The vase became more than decoration, it was a promise to myself that beauty belonged in my life, however modest. My son noticed. Once he asked why I kept buying flowers. I told him simply, because I like them. He didn't argue. He nodded, and I saw in his eyes a faint recognition that I was not just mother, not just habit, but a person with her own desires. That was enough. One morning, he came into the kitchen, poured 2 cups of coffee, and set one down in front of me without a word. I looked at it, then at him, and something unspoken passed between us. Not forgiveness, not a grand reconciliation, but an understanding. We were learning each other again, not as child and parent locked in old roles, but as 2 people sharing the same space, trying to see each other more clearly. Late at night, when I woke at 3, I no longer went to the cabinet. I didn't need to. Instead, I made tea, sat by the window, and opened the notebook. I would read the lines I had written. You were there. It mattered. Being needed is not the same as being seen. I spoke. He listened. Then I would close the book and let the silence rest gently around me. The hurt was still part of me, but so was the strength. One evening, walking back from the park, I saw my reflection in a shop window, scarf loose around my shoulders, flower stem peeking from my bag, eyes steady. I stopped for a moment, studying myself, and thought, you are here. Not just surviving, not just enduring. Here. And when I returned home, unlocking the door to the place we both shared, I no longer felt like I was slipping back into invisibility. I set the flower in the vase, boiled water for tea, and let the quiet settle. The house was the same, but I was not. That was enough.